Welcome to The Joyful Frugalista, the podcast that's all about living a richer life with less. I'm your host, Serina Bird, author and passionate frugalista. Each episode, we dive into inspiring stories, practical tips and joyful conversations that help you create abundance, embrace mindful spending, and live your best life, all without breaking the bank. So grab a cuppa, get comfy, and let's explore how being a frugalista can lead to freedom, happiness, and a whole lot of joy. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Please consult a qualified professional before making financial decisions. Hello Frugalistas, and welcome to today's episode. Today I have a very special guest, and of course all of my guests are special. And today we're going to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart, and that is housing. More particularly, we are going to talk not just about bricks and mortar, but about home and Australia's broken path to home ownership. But first, if you love this podcast and find it useful, please pay it forward by liking or commenting. And also join the Joyful Frugalista Facebook group to join in on discussions with like-minded frugalistas. Today, I am joined by Lucinda Hartley, author of this fabulous book, which we're going to be talking about, who is an award-winning urban designer, housing expert. You've got a copy too.
Everywhere.
Yeah, let's both do it together. There. Oh, actually, I've got to do it the right side around. There we go. So Lucinda is an award-winning urban designer, housing expert and serial entrepreneur, named one of Australia's top 100 most influential women by the Australian Financial Review. And she spent 20 years designing cities and asking why the housing system is broken. She's also co-founder of Zero Home Loans, that's Zero with a Z-E-R-O-O. And she is working to fix the broken system, locking Australians out of home ownership through an equity growth model. She is an urban futurist who helped create the UN Sustainable Development Goals for cities, and she's worked on city-shaping projects for Google. And so her new book, which we're going to talk about, Finding Home, published by Major Street Publishing, which is also my publisher, and obviously I think they're excellent, is a practical guide to finding a home in today's market. So hello, Lucinda. Congratulations on your very thought-provoking book.
Thanks, Serina. It's good to be here.
So you're a housing expert, and you're a different housing expert to the normal housing experts I have on the Joyful Frugalista, because usually it's all about, how to leverage different strategies to have a huge portfolio. But you're actually, an urban planner who's thought deeply about what makes people connected and where home is.
Yeah, I think unfortunately our housing conversation has been limited often to housing as an asset vehicle. And of course, there's lots of capital growth to be had around property. It is an important part of financial security for most Australians. But when we zero in on just that conversation, I describe it like trying to find a life partner based on only knowing their credit score. And you wouldn't do that. You want to understand their personality and their lifestyle and how they spend their time. And buying a home to live in, which is what the focus of this book is, the owner-occupied house as opposed to investment houses, has many different considerations that aren't only about the finance, but the finance is in the centre, and it becomes a trade-off of the push and pull of how do you make those balanced decisions that prioritise what's the biggest financial decision most people will make in their life against all of the other choices you have to make around your time, your community, your relationships, your work. It's really complicated and hard for people to unpack.
Yeah, it can be very hard too. And especially you've got a very limited window when you're viewing a property.
Yeah.
Often you're competing with other people. There's only so many people who can fit into the bathroom, for instance, at the same time. And you're sort of eyeing off the other potential buyers. And it's hard then to think about what would this space actually mean for me and my family, those who are moving with families, when you have such a limited opportunity to view the property.
Yeah, I think, if you've got the right kind of mindset, the book tries to guide you through making those decisions or thinking about those questions beforehand. A lot of our idea of housing, of what we think we want, is often what we're told to want rather than what we necessarily want. And I say that when we think about the Great Australian Dream, if I say those words, it has a connotation in people's heads. They're thinking about a detached home, a freestanding home, ideally with a backyard, usually with a bit of space in the suburbs. But in fact, the Great Australian Dream was never about that. The Great Australian Dream was about housing security. It wasn't about the quarter acre block. But over time, we've become entwined with those messages. And so we think that's what we're told to want. And what I really ask people to reflect on is, when you think about home, is that a story that you have created, or is it a story that you've inherited from somewhere else? And if you actually take a look at your life, what it looks like today, does that type of house actually suit you? Is that actually what you really need? And it might be, but I would challenge people to really deeply think about it, because we often inherit these ideas based on what our parents did or our grandparents did, but we live completely differently today. Our lifestyles are nothing the same.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenging assumptions that you unpack in your book, and I really do like your treatment of that Great Australian Dream and the quarter acre block, actually. So maybe I might ask you a bit more about that to unpack some of that. So where did this kind of concept of this come from in the first place?
So what we have to realise is the entire idea of home ownership in Australia was created in the post-war period and really driven by a policy agenda. So before World War II, home ownership rates in Australia were less than 40%. Now, come World War II, baby boom period, 1950s, we've got a huge housing shortage. And so there was a massive government policy to instill home ownership. Part of that was massive construction drives to tackle employment. There was a lot of government housing built at that time, but we reached close to 70% home ownership within about 15 years. So it's pretty extraordinary. But when you actually really boil it down, part of the objective, and I'm missing many steps here, you can look at them in the book, was to stop people becoming communist. It was the idea that if you
I'm
were,
laughing, but it's a big thing.
yeah, it was a big deal in the 50s and 60s. And the idea was, if you had a mortgage, you needed a job. You needed a job, you need to work hard. That's going to keep you busy and it's going to stop you being communist. And so this was kind of like one of the underlying drivers of getting everyone to own a home. And of course, having a home is a foundation for financial security. It enabled all kinds of other economic growth. It's been a really positive story for Australia until recently, when the dynamics became unaffordable. But it's actually it's an identity and a mindset that I question whether it belongs today. The Great Australian Dream was, if we think about the 1950s and 60s, it was a different family orientation than we have today. People worked differently. They didn't have technology like we do. We live differently, we work differently, our family structures are different, and yet somehow we expect our housing to be the same. And why is that? Like, why can't we also evolve our mindset of what a good home looks like as well?
Yeah, and different community structures too. Like more women were at home, so you had more communities in the suburbs,
Yep.
which is very different now as well.
Absolutely. We're commuting further, we're traveling further, we're working differently. Even what home is, we need to work from home a lot of the time these days. So, yeah, I guess the book doesn't make a right or wrong answer for that, because, your choice is going to be completely different from my choice compared to all of the different factors. But I am shocked at how little, like you say, the 15-minute window, often I'm shocked how little people actually consider how they live before they buy a house. Because once you've got the home, whatever you choose, an apartment or a house, it's then going to dictate everything else, like where you work and how far you commute and who you're friends with and how often you see your family. That's all determined by your house. So I say try to answer some of those questions for yourself first, and then you can be much more intentional about that 15-minute window that you've got to take a look.
Yeah, so just to share, I bought a house a year ago. So I had a house in the suburbs and then got divorced, and that sounds like something you can maybe relate to.
Yeah.
Did keep the family home for a while, but decided that it was actually too much, not financially, actually. It was actually more the distance, the commute, and the fact that there was a lot of maintenance and young children. And to be honest, there's all this pressure, I think, sometimes to have houses with lots of yards with young children, but you're so busy often. Like, who's got time for the gardening and the maintenance? But anyway, that's I guess my personal view. Moved into an apartment, and that served us very well for 8 years. I thought we'd only be there for 5, and then we were there for 8. But it was very convenient, walking distance to the kids' schools, so they could walk to and from school. But then a year ago, we bought a house, and so it's the conventional kind of typical dream, 5 kilometres from the CBD. 900 square meters, or close to 1960s double brick. So it's the really conventional stereotypical home, and actually it's worked really well for us because it's close to the kids' school, it's close to our work, it's close to public transport, close to the light rail. And what's been transformative particularly is my boys have friends who live close by, so they often have people. So that's what's been really great, and a really good buy-nothing group, so it's really good community. But yeah, there were a lot of things to consider, and it wasn't just the house. It was a lot of things about, how we live, where we live, what was important to us.
Yeah, and other people in your life as well, which I think is actually why buying a home is such an overwhelming decision. And the challenge is not that it's complex. The challenge is that we expect it to be simple. Because if you're on TikTok or you're online, you'll read like 5 steps to buying your home, or like pay off your mortgage in 10 years, I think, which is actually much harder than it looks. I've had a look at your book. It's not actually
It
that
is.
simple.
It is.
There's lots of things to consider, but you'll get these kind of how-to guides which tell you how to cut through and get a mortgage. And some of it is simple, right? The actual process, I mean, it may not be affordable, but the actual process of getting a home loan is a step-by-step process that you follow. You submit documents, you get approved. But then the reason it's complex is you have to decide, what does my life look like now and in the future? What does my partner's life look like now and in the future? Kids, real imagined future now. And you've got this multi-dimensional equation to try and fit in, and it's complicated, and it should be complicated. And while I don't think there is necessarily an easy cut through, I think there are frameworks that can help you break that down. Like, I prefer to look at housing rather than this forever home and what I need in all of my life, as why not consider your home as a series of chapters, as it sounds like you've done. You've gone from home to apartment, back to home again. This idea that we have to trade up and get more and more and more each time. Who said you have to do that? Like, I would actually, when I look around in the demographic I am now with, primary and teenage kids, there is a desire naturally to want more space, and especially as your kids are becoming mini adults. But then by the time, because it takes so long to save and buy a house now, by the time you get to that large house, the kids are probably 18. They've got 5 years at home, and then you're left in the huge house and they've left. And so it's like, well, maybe you could rent the large house and own an apartment and move back into it. There's sort of other ways that we can meet our housing needs if we're not fixed on the building being the home. If you think of home as something that you create, it's an action, and you can create that in many different varieties of spaces, then you have some flexibility to move around with your different life stage, and that can really help affordability, really.
Yeah. I love the example you have in your book about your first place when you had your first child. Well, actually, you didn't have that place thinking you would have a family.
No.
Yeah, so maybe if you could share a bit about that space.
Yeah, so the first apartment that I bought with my former husband was basically a studio apartment. It was 49 square meters. That's about 2.5 car parks for size. And we didn't think that we'd be there very long, and we had jobs in international work at the time, so we weren't really expecting to be home much. And then shortly after that, we found out we were pregnant, and I guess had a choice to make about whether we stayed there or not. And this place didn't even have a balcony, like it was really very tiny. And we decided to stay in the end, but we were treating space more as a design problem than as a space problem. And everyone thought, oh, you could never have a baby in that space, or you couldn't have a toddler in that space. But I think the mistake that we make is we think that we have to own all the space that we use. And the way that we looked at that apartment was 2 things. One, we looked at it as a design exercise. So we turned it into like a Swiss Army knife apartment. It had a fold-down bed and a fold-down dining table, and we made the most of all of the spaces. But the reason that we were able to stay there is that we used the whole neighborhood. Like, the cafe became our backyard, and, we used the shops for different things. We went to friends' houses for other things. We were across the road from a park. And when you consider not what you're losing in space, but what you're gaining from the neighborhood, you've actually got a different equation about what you need to own versus what you need to use. And that, again, can be really useful for thinking about housing affordability, because you can share more and own less.
Yeah, I really love that too. It reminds me a lot of Japanese aesthetics, like
Yeah.
traditional housing. So, you'd sleep on the floor, you wouldn't have like big beds and big dining tables. It was quite different.
Yeah. And look, we stayed there until my son was 4, and I thought that we did a pretty good job of that. And then when the second kid came along, it did eventually become too tiny for us. But yeah, I think it's about being creative about space. Often I think space is a design problem more than it is a square meter problem.
Yeah, exactly. And you do talk in your book about how space for people has changed over the years.
So Australia has the largest homes in the world, actually. On average, Australian homes are larger than the US, Canada, UK, much larger than in Europe. So, 240 square meters would be the average Australian home. In Europe, it's about 150 square meters. In that great Australian dream era, post-war era, homes were only 100 square meters, which would feel very small by today's standards. Now, we want space for all kinds of reasons, and that might be the right choice for you as well if you're listening. But the challenge with larger space is more cost as well. Construction costs have gone up and up. So every time you add a bedroom, you add the floor area, the house costs more. That
Heating and cooling costs.
cleaning,
Yes.
maintenance, everything else goes like proportionally up with that. And I think that that's something that we should keep in balance, because not only have homes got bigger, but the average family size has got smaller. So we've got actually fewer people living in more space. And we've kind of normalized that, which is, again, it's just something to question. It doesn't, draw a right or wrong opinion about that. But it's like, do you actually need it? And some of the examples that I give, like a backyard costs about $250 a week on average, maybe more. And that's great if you use it. You might have a dog, kids, great. You're using it. If it's something you don't use, that's an extra $1,000 a month that you could be putting into going on holidays or somewhere else. So you want to make these trade-offs intelligently rather than thinking you have to own all of that.
Yeah, no, well said. So I love my vegetable garden in my new house. So it's still in its very early stages, although I had lots of pumpkins this year. 21, in fact. I've spoken about that number quite a lot. But yeah, I know. And I don't really like pumpkins, but I like growing them and I love watching how they've been growing. And we've had lots and lots of tomatoes, and I'm, making green tomato relish like no tomorrow. But every time I look at that, I think, well, they're my $1 million tomatoes, because
Yeah.
that's really the entry price to get into a property where you can have something like a veggie patch now in the suburbs. Like, is it worth $1 million? That's a lot of tomatoes I can buy at the farmers markets.
Or live near
Um,
a community garden, or maybe you're in an apartment building with a shared vegetable garden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then I did try to have a vegetable garden in my last apartment building out the back, and it just didn't
Yeah.
work. So, one of the kids kept pulling stuff out there, and it just wasn't the same vibe. You'd forget to water it. And I know there are community gardens and I have friends who do it. It just wasn't the same. So to me it's deeply symbolic. I love it, and it is worth it to me. But,
Yeah.
they are the trade-offs, right? To have that sort of dream, it is a lot of money to invest in.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even things that we consider now, like work from home, for example, we've kind of outsourced the costs that your employer would normally pay for an office space into your home, and you need to pay for it. And what that normally means is that people need another bedroom. So if you're going to work from home a lot, like more than part-time, you probably want to study. Adding another bedroom, another 100 grand to your house. To get that, you probably move further away from the city in order to have the space, and then you're even less likely to go into the office because the commute time is greater. And so you've kind of got this self-perpetuating cycle. Now, I work from home full time, so like I fully embrace that working from home, but it's also highly duplicative if all of us have a home office. Like if you're living in an apartment building, maybe combine a level as a co-working space and have more room in your apartment. It's this, how do we think more intelligently about space and cost?
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's me who's sitting in my front room, which is also doubles as my home office. But
Yeah.
it definitely happens. And I did also like the case studies you had, particularly of a lady who moved much further out with the
Yeah.
promise of a lot of things eventuating that would make it easier over time. And it didn't quite meet her expectation.
So most of the dream that we're sold, around this house and land means you've got to move further and further out. Like every 10 years, we're moving another 10 minutes out, another 10 minutes out. And over time, that gets pretty far. The average commute now is over an hour in a capital city in Australia. And a lot of people are traveling more than 2 hours to work. Now, you can have I really believe in good quality growth on the fringe. I think it's possible, but you need to be building whole towns almost. Where it's really important to do your research is if you're buying a house and the infrastructure isn't committed, you could be living with just a house in a paddock with a road or even a dirt road that's not connected for years. And A woman that I interviewed for the book in Perth had bought further out, and there was a promise of a new railway station, a new town centre, and it took 12 years to arrive. And so all of this time she was commuting further than she wanted to. She was living further away from her friends. So she got the house that she wanted, but it really wasn't the lifestyle. And the interesting thing about her is she's now living in actually a similar kind of new suburb, but it's one where all of the infrastructure has been built, and it's a totally different experience. So this isn't a comment about inner versus outer necessarily. It's about doing your research on all of the other things that you need to live, because a house is part of it, but you also need school, transport, shops, parks. If these things aren't committed to be built, and you can find that out from your local government or other planning authority, then, it's going to be a pretty diminished life, or you're going to have to spend a lot of time trying to meet those needs in other ways.
Yeah, definitely. And I've noticed that in Canberra, where I live, we have a lot of new suburbs. We're quite, a fast-growing place. And some of them have worked really well. Like I know I had a friend who moved into Gungahlin very early. At that point, Gungahlin, I think, was one of the fastest-growing suburbs in Australia. And I must say I was very doubtful, but the town centre there is really thriving. But other areas have been described as almost being dormitories because there's not much out there, really.
That's right. And this is the real challenge right now, in that, we have a housing supply shortage. It's really important that we build more homes. However, if we only build homes, then we're going to end up with all kinds of secondary problems, because you still need to work, and your kids still need to go to childcare and school, and you still need to move around. All of that other infrastructure really has to be planned and delivered at the same time, and that's expensive. It's hard to do.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm noting actually, and someone pointed this out and I've realised it is a problem, is actually the lack of churches. Now, I'm not saying that from a religious point of view necessarily, but it's the halls, it's the community spaces. And
Yeah.
the modern community spaces, they're not the same. They tend to be smaller. There's one near me that was built recently, and it sort of had space for boardroom meetings and things like that, but you couldn't hold an event there.
Yeah.
You couldn't run like a cadet group out there, or you couldn't run a Girl Guides or a Scouts out there. They're just very small spaces.
Yeah. It's a really important Churches have historically provided an important community space, like a third place, if you like. Like urban planners talk about that. Like your first place is your home, and your second place is your work. Your third place is, your libraries, your sports ovals. It could be a church, or it could be a cafe. It could be a gym. The other places where you go to build community, meet others. There's a wide variety of community spaces that exist, but the provision that they provide, particularly if we're living in higher density locations, is that they provide a need for those kinds of events and other spaces. If you're living in an apartment and you want to host a party, but you don't want to spend thousands of dollars, those kinds of community halls provide such a great resource. So there's something that we really have to consider, particularly if we're living at higher density.
So Australians love lifestyle. And I remember, back when I started becoming really frugal, I used to laugh about this a lot because I'd hear the term all the time. It seemed to be like almost like a real estate agent's code for selling people a large house with a pool and all sorts of things. But really, it is an important concept. And you do talk a lot about lifestyle in your book. So why is it important? And from an urban planning perspective, what does that mean?
So I probably have a little bit of a different definition, but I think the popular definition of when we think about lifestyle, we think about home decorating and entertaining, and it's sort of a homemaker kind of word, I guess, or it's about having parties and events and that kind of lifestyle. For want of a better word, because there isn't one that I can think of, I define lifestyle, and I think urban planners would define lifestyle as just how you live your life, like the routines and the rituals and the patterns that make your life you. So what does a normal, boring, everyday look like? What time do you get up? Where do you go to work? Do you have other drop-offs and sport and other activities? Do you go to the gym? Do you come home? Do you watch Netflix? Like an ordinary, boring day. Like often we buy homes imagining that once a year barbecue that we're going to have.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of house to own for the once a year activity. You could do that at the church hall or the community hall. But what does that everyday lifestyle look like? And the way I tend to think about that is then like, what do you need based on that? So if you've actually got a lot of moving around, like, you need to be in a CBD area or you visit clients all over town, you're going to have location is going to matter for where you need to go in a normal, everyday, boring day. Things like schools anchor people a lot to suburbs. I work from home right now, so technically I could live anywhere, but I need to live near an airport because I travel frequently, and it would be really inconvenient if I lived on the other side of town and it took me 2 hours to get to the airport because I need to do it most weeks, for example.
It's stressful if you're stuck in traffic.
Yeah. Want to be near my kids' school. So it's looking at the habits or the rituals and routines. And I'd say routines is like what your everyday looks like. And then rituals are the things that make you you. So, are you into, I don't know, ceramics, or do you really like hanging out with your friends? I mean, hopefully we all like hanging out with your friends. But some people love entertaining. It's like it's something that they do all the time. And I don't think you need to have a big house to do it, but you might need a certain type of kitchen to do that. Or is it, do you like bike riding, and where are you going to keep the bikes securely? So there's the rituals are the things that make you you, and the routines in the everyday. And once you map that out and really get an understanding of like doing a time map, like if you've ever had to keep a timesheet at work, but just do it for your life, think about how that equates to a home that you could live in. And usually the first time people do this exercise, come up with this ideal house that has everything. And it's not actually about that. It's about like, what's the minimum viable life that you could tolerate? Because mostly you're going to have to make some significant trade-offs, that you can't have everything that you want, but what's the minimum that's actually going to make your life you?
Yeah, I love cooking, for instance. And when we were looking at houses, there was one that was an ideal location, but the kitchen was really small. It was smaller than my apartment kitchen. And for me, it wasn't worth the move to have a smaller kitchen. Like, I didn't need a super huge one, but there was no real option to extend in terms of where the house planning was. So therefore, that wasn't for us. But I mean, I know friends who've got very similar size, one in particular who's got one almost identical kind of layout, and it works fine for them.
Yeah. That's right. And even a lot of modern apartment buildings have an entertainment room with a huge kitchen. So your everyday kitchen is smaller naturally with space, but they might have a shared kitchen. So those times that you want to entertain as opposed to cooking at home, you've got much larger facilities to do that, which I think is a clever idea for sharing the things that you need occasionally and owning the things that you use every day.
And that's also something you're very passionate about in your book. You talk about some, projects you've been involved with that do have shared communal spaces.
Yep. Yeah, so I spent a lot of time in my early career working in a field of work I guess you'd call placemaking. I mean, it is called placemaking, but that word requires a little bit of unpacking because it's has different connotations. But it really means improving public spaces, streets and public spaces, and how do you turn streets into public spaces and parks into more active, vibrant spaces, or businesses into business spaces into more active spaces. And through a lot of that work, I think what I really learned is that the value of those projects, so we turned streets into kids' playgrounds, we turned parks that were unsafe and we kind of like guerrilla gardened them to make them into new spaces. The outcome wasn't that they looked more beautiful. The outcome was that the community was involved in creating it. And so there was a lot of pride and attachment that got associated with people loved these spaces, and they were very DIY, and they were not the most beautiful playground and they were not the most beautiful garden. But because everyone had spent their weekend building it, they were so proud of it. And that analogy actually, I think, applies to your home as well. Like, there's some great research that if you build your own IKEA shelf compared to buying it, you think it's worth more because you built it, which is a weird psychology because actually they've outsourced the labor to you rather than you purchasing the labor. But when we talk about being house proud or proud of our home, sometimes we think we have to have a fancy house, for want of a better word. But actually those feelings of pride come from the action of creating your house. You can't buy pride in your home. You have to create pride in your home. And you could actually then do that in all kinds of spaces. That process of improvement and making it yours is really, really important. And I think that's one thing actually about home ownership that is particularly valuable. It's much harder to achieve that as a renter with the limitations. So apart from all of the other limitations and constraints with renting, one of them is you tend to be less proud of where you live because you're not able to kind of create in that same way.
Yeah, definitely that ownership, that co-creation, I guess.
Yeah.
So you talk a lot about finance, and I know this is something that you are deeply passionate about as well as an entrepreneur. So you talk about some modern finance options, things like shared equity, rent to buy, and co-ownership. So which of these do you think Australians are more ready to embrace?
So it's interesting and the book talks a lot about finance. I know we haven't spoken a lot about sort of mortgages and finance today, but that is really the central question that you have
I know,
to.
terrible, right? As a
Yeah,
frugalist who's
well,
written
no,
about these things.
it is. You have to answer that question of what your kind of envelope of borrowing capacity is before you can even consider that question. But where I think we get the story wrong is we think we've got this binary rent or buy, apartment or house on the fringe, as if they're the only choices. And what I think is actually exciting, and it's a lot of case studies in the book, is if you dig beneath that, there are many, many different models. So there are new ways to buy. So we have this myth of a house deposit. Perhaps it's been sort of dispelled slightly with the government's 5% deposit scheme, the support of the lender's mortgage insurance, but you actually don't have to have a deposit to buy a house. So the program that I work on full time with Zaru Home Loans is a 0% deposit mortgage product. So trying to overcome that deposit barrier. There are shared equity models in most states in Australia. There's a government supported shared equity model where you can co-own the house underwritten by government support that reduces the size of your mortgage, can help you get in. There are co-ownership models. It's not as popular, as in it's not as common, let's say, but it is popular, and there are groups who exist to help you manage the legal side of co-owning. Because we often think of jointly owning like with a romantic partner or perhaps with a sibling, but imagine you and 5 other friends got together to own a house. That might seem great now, but what if one of you gets a job in Singapore and has to move and wants to sell out? Like there's other constraints. So you actually need to think through the legal frameworks, and there are groups that help you do that. And there's also like different ways to rent. So one of the problems with renting is the security of tenure. So I'd actually prefer to rent right now. If I'm honest, I'm probably a real outlier in Australia like that, in that I like the flexibility. My life is pretty mobile. But what I don't like about rent, and the reason that I've chosen to own, is I had like 4 rentals in 3 years. Like I just had this situation of moving on and on and on. And with a family, that's just untenable. So, but there is models like build to rent, like institutional landlords rather than mum and dad landlords, where you can have a 10-year lease, where you can paint the walls, you can have pets, lots of shared amenities. And so your renting feels like owning, and it creates that kind of security. And there's many others as well. But what I challenge in the book is that I think Australia is absolutely ready for build to rent. I think while most Australians should aspire to home ownership, and that still, for many can be a possibility, and if we take some actions with the market, not everyone necessarily always wants that. And if we take away some of the other the problems with renting, like the insecurity, there is a big model for this institutional build to rent. It's a huge sector in the US. Like most rentals in the US are not owned by a mum and dad investor. They're owned by like a large company who's managing thousands of apartments, this kind of multifamily development. So we have a space for that here. I think the UK is similar. Yeah, there's different options, but I think we're ready for moving beyond the deposit barrier, and I think we're ready for build to rent would be the ones I think we're most ready for.
Yeah, I see build to rent a lot, and I'm following it with interest.
It's got its own complexities and commercial models, and it's harder for developers to get it off the ground in lots of ways and all of that. But I think we can, in time, overcome those barriers. And I would like to see that is a whole way of living, like a third category of what we don't have now.
So finally, do you have a frugalista tip to share?
Yeah, so I mean, on a personal level, I think there's always lots of different ways that we can save. We should be frugal. I mean, thinking about housing, such a huge equation. My frugalista tip is like think rationally about what you need to own in a home versus what you can share with others. So if you really think about that, you could probably get away with owning less, smaller house, smaller mortgage, so long as it's in a location that's going to meet your needs. So that's something that I would really encourage people to think about.
I love that too. I'm a member of, there's a toolbox close to us. There's a tool library. They call it the Canberra or CBR tool library. Where I'm struggling a little bit is getting my husband on board because he still wants to have that ownership of toys. I'm kind of like, you don't really need to own it. Like, how often do you need a hedge trimmer? Like
Yeah.
once a year. Like you don't need it all the time. But it's a hard concept, I think. This kind of wanting to own things is hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And it needs to be convenient. So it doesn't always work. A tool library is going to be great if it's right down the street and it's close by for those times you can pop out. If it was right across town, it's not going to work for you. Yeah, but sometimes I think we don't even ask the question, particularly when it comes to like how many bedrooms do I need, or like what do I need in my home? How big a backyard do I need? There's a lot of assumptions about I need XYZ and XYZ equals this price, therefore I have to move away to get that option. I mean, maybe that could absolutely be the right choice for you, but if you thought, well, kids used to share a room, would the world end if they shared? Because if you saved yourself, an extra $500 a week by not having the spare bedroom, you could probably invest that in a lot of other activities for your kids. So yeah, that's I think looking at your whole life picture by thinking of owning, that lens of owning versus sharing, I think can help us use our money differently.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, thank you so much for being my guest, and thank you to everyone for listening. So keep growing, keep going, and keep finding joy in the small wins. And I'd love to see you in the Joyful Frugalista Facebook group and on Instagram.